Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Samuel Oteng. I am a fashion designer from Ghana and also a researcher with the OR Foundation. Um, I have been around this topic for about a decade now. It's something that began just like, an interest based upon another friend, but it has become something that is very, very dear to me and then something that has almost become a life's purpose to me right now. Today, I'm just going to talk about neocolonialism and colonialism in like this space of fashion in the context of Ghana and how it has its impact in design and the state of fashion as it is right now in the context of Ghana and Africa as a whole. As I go on, just let me know if I'm not too clear or I'm going too fast or too slow. Just let me know. I will start off talking about the relation of clothes as Ghanaians have it and how it has transcended into modern times. So generally, the whole idea of fashion when it comes to Ghana or Africa in that context is one that is very built on a very deep relation with clothing and in fashion in general. So if we look at fashion before pre-colonial times in the context of Ghana and Africa as a whole, there's always been this idea of respect and a close relation to clothes. That is, most of these clothes, or the idea of clothing and clothing making and fashion in the first place, was something that is very inherent in every home or every household. So basically, everybody like knew how to make their own clothes or the stuff they were going to put on until the whole idea of ready to wear or whatever it is that it is on right now or whatever it is that we've gone into right now started. But the whole movement or the whole shift onto how fashion has come currently in Ghana and how it used to be has like is a whole gap, like a whole great shift that has happened. And if I say this, I mean by the idea of cultural shift, the idea of watering down or stripping down people from what they used to know or what they're used to or what their culture is or what their tradition is. It has a way of moving slowly that it becomes a new culture. So as I said, like in a traditional setting or in a traditional African setting, clothes are made by their own, like by the people who wear them, or people who wear their own clothes have a relation with them. That is, for someone to make a clothes here traditionally, they'd have to go to a textile weaver or a fabric dyer or maker, purchase their fabric from them, have usually they are part of the design that comes on the fabric as well. That is done. It is being sent to the designer or the tailor or dressmaker who's going to make the dress. The discussion is made between them. So whoever is wearing the dress and then whoever is making the dress, there's always a discussion. So it's not like the clothes is made separately or isolatedly from the person who's going to wear them. So from that point, we can clearly see the kind of relationships that like traditionally Africans or Ghanaian in this context have until the shift of clothing that is just a commodity. So if we look at this changes through or this disparity between how like traditionally or how indigenously we see clothes or appreciate clothes, it is very different from what like the global north or what we currently know and how we associate to clothing. And to me, I personally believe that one of the reasons why we are going through all of these issues as as a people is also because we have ignored the part that clothing is actually something that we need to have a relationship with. and not just see it as a product or as a commodity or something disposable that you just buy off the rack and then throw it away the next day. And moving on into this, one thing that really changed or caused a shift is the emergence of colonialism. And that is subject to the fact that before all of these started, before colonialism, as I said, we were in charge of what we were. We knew what we were about. We were deep into the artisanal and the craft of cloth making. But now there is a shift because when we talk about colonialism, before anybody could be colonized before, like at all, whoever the person is needs to be taught differently or needs to be pushed into a space where they feel like whatever they are used to before is not good enough. So it comes to a point, this shift comes to a point where it gets to a point we don't appreciate like the whole culture of clothing anymore, that you want to have something else. And that happens to the cause of assimilation. Because if you have somebody being, on top of you or controlling you and telling you that what you have is not good enough, so you have to change it to a certain type of way, or you have to change it to their way because that's the best way, it is not something that happens overnight, but after a short while, it causes this tradition that you feel like what you have is not good enough, so you feel the need to change it because you need to assimilate and feel accepted or feel or become part of the growing culture as it stands. So through this shift, through people thinking that what they're having is not enough, or the kind of clothing they're wearing is not enough, or the type of relationship that they have with clothing or garments is not how it's supposed to be, it becomes a tradition. And what happens is, if, for example, I am a parent and I am accepting that whatever it is that I have or whatever it is that I put behind my back is not good enough, it goes on to for me, like I keep on preaching or telling the same things to my kids or my wards. And then what happens is, if this happens, it moves on for it to become a tradition. Because if I do something and pass it on to my kids, and my kids pass it on to their kids, it doesn't take long for it to become a tradition. And then what happens to the tradition is that the more it goes on as a tradition, it becomes a culture. Now, here's a case where we've moved from colonialism as it should stand, but we've gotten to a state where everything is controlled, or like even the fashion curriculum, the fashion education curriculum, as we have it in Ghana and Africa as a whole, is one that is based off on the modules or the educational curriculum of the West or the global North. So it really creates a shift. Now, here's a personal example that I would like to make. So throughout my college years, whilst I was still in fashion school, there were so many times that we had, foreign press come in and magazines come in, and they are always looking for, Black creatives or African creatives to work with or to create pieces for editorials and stuff like that. And then what happened was that every time that these opportunities come, of course, is an exciting opportunity for a college student or a fashion student for that matter. But what happens is that because these people are the ones controlling whatever that it is they're coming, they come to you seeking for help, but they end up controlling whatever it is that you're bringing up to them. So, for example, if a top magazine comes up to you telling you about what it is that you need to create or what it is that you need to give to them in order for them to put into their magazine or whatever, there's this whole shift onto moving what you feel is right within the idea of your creativity or your narrative into something else, because this time you're doing something that serves them and not yourselves, or not serves yourself or your narrative. So putting like all of these things together, you tend to understand how the idea of colonialism in the case of the past, and the idea of a neocolonialism in the idea of of how modern fashion education in the context of Ghana and Africa is that modules do not even include, um, like, let's include African fashion history, and then there's more of European fashion history or American fashion history or whatever. And this makes no sense. And what this does is this really pushes you into the idea of like a different relation or a different narrative around clothes in the context of Ghana. And if you take it generally into education, there's always this idea that if you are a creative, you already put in into, like, coming from this side of the world, you're already being tagged, a black designer or African designer, which is not a bad thing. But the thing is, if you are being put in this space and then you are not being given or empowered enough to tell the narrative as an African or as a black person, it has a whole way of changing everything and then setting a precedent. Because if you move on trying to get into like a higher ground or trying to get to the next level of your education or your journey as a fashion designer or creative or whatever it is that you find yourself into, it becomes very difficult because already there isn't a lot of spaces that is accepting your true self or your narrative as you bring it. And there's a lot of watering down and diluting of what your idea may be or what your narrative may be that you want to put out there. So looking at all of these and how it is related, it goes on to really create a shift or moves away from how generally we relate to clothes or we relate to the idea of garment or fashion in the first place. And from hello.
We can hear you, Sammy.
Oh, sorry. I just had a little break in my internet. Hi. Yeah. So if we talk about all of these things and then how different our relation to clothing is as compared to, like, the modernization of clothing, as I should say, if I could say, with like what the global north see, you can really see the difference. And for me, one of the, like, the biggest thing or one of the biggest problems, like, I think generally we have in fashion in terms of, fashion ways, second clothing or whatever, is because there isn't really any relation to clothing anymore. We only see clothing as a commodity. We only see clothing as something disposable. We only see clothing as something that you could just buy off the rack because it's cheap. But the thing is not, the idea of clothing is not just clothing. There's so many things that come in connection when it comes to, garment clothing or the clothes that we put on our back. Like, we have people who, like, right from the beginning, from the cotton fields or whatever, wherever this the textile material is coming from, the raw materials are coming from, to the part where designers actually have to design, to the point where they're garment workers working on the garments, producing the garments, to the point where it hits the shop floor, to the point where consumers, buy these garments, to the point where it ends their wardrobe, to the point where it moves onto their wardrobe, onto a second user. All of these things really set the dynamic. You can just juxtapose these two things and understand how different when it comes to the relation that we have with clothing as it dispersed from the north, the global north, onto the global south, on in this case, Ghana and Africa as a whole. So another thing is, as these shifts happen, as these things happen, and in the fact that we are in this space, one of the biggest worry or one of the biggest concerns is the fact that at a point is also going to create a shift even here for creators. Because the thing is, if you're going to create something where you're constantly going to criticize on, or you're not being given the space, or you are caused to move from the idea of fashion being something that is not just like a product sales, but something that relates to basically every part of our lives, it really just caused a shift. Because if you don't have a relationship with the kind of clothing that you've been making or the kind of things that you're putting out there for people to use, there's really no value to it. It would only be seen as clothing. It's only when we have that relation, we appreciate where we have that relationship enough that we appreciate where, the raw materials are coming from, where it was processed, where the clothes were made, where it was bought, where it ended up, and then even the conscious effort of making the decision of buying those clothes is literally not going to have like any value at all. So until we move from the idea of clothing just being clothing and not something that, is connected to everything else, because it's not something that you just, push a button and it just appears, or something that comes out of thin air. It's something that goes through several processes, goes through several hands. So if you're seeing clothing as just clothing without, connecting it to every stage, right from where, from the field where the raw material was taken onto the point where it ends on your back as, a piece of as an item of clothing, there is always going to be that disparity between, clothing and everything that else that it comes with, be it socially, being environmentally, being economically, being politically. It is always going to be difficult until there is a relationship with clothing. Now, talking about clothing in terms of fast fashion and overproduction and everything, it also stems on this same fact that there's really no relation. Because as I said before, if there is, if there is, for example, hello, hello.
We can hear you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. So if there is that relationship, as I said earlier, between clothing and people, there's generally going to be a move from there. And the reason why, when it comes to Ghana and Africa as a context, there has been this relationship, and I feel neocolonialism is moving the shift, is because right now in fashion education, as I said, in Ghana, people are very used to making pre-ordered clothes or bespoke clothes, or basically couture made clothes, not just off the rack or ready to wear clothes. But now, in fashion schools or even like conferences or workshops about fashion that you go right now, there's been like a really big move or push towards like ready to wear and fast fashion, and even people coming in basically to train fashion students in special courses just so they can move into ready to wear and the fast fashion space. And if you think about it, this is just a way of, because all of these things usually come with the promises of giving you exposure, of the promises of giving you, getting you into onto an international level. But what happens here is like, if we were all going to look forward to the profits or the gains that we're gonna like get from all of these things without particularly paying attention to the stages or the people or whatever it is that really pays the price for all of these things that we want to do, that is when we will know how deep this goes. Because when it comes to, these things, is not just like, an issue of just the clothing itself. It extends way back deeper into things. For example, if you take one particular garment, it's it's not just like the wearer of the garment, but right from the beginning, where whatever raw material was used for that garment was made onto the point where it is moved from the first consumers or the first wearers wardrobe onto the second one, or probably the third one, onto where it ends in landfill. So if we as fashion people or fashion enthusiasts are going to particularly pay attention to the fact that fashion just, or the clothing, the item of clothing that we put on has a relation and goes beyond just it being a clothing item, it will really make us understand how far it is that we go into just wearing our clothes, like how deep it runs into just like having our clothes. It's not something that is just material, but it moves on to like a cultural level, political level, environmental level, and a social level as well. I'm trying to share the screen now, but
Here, I can make you co-host,
okay,
or I will just grant you permission to screen share. Give me a moment.
okay.
Let me know if you're able to share your screen now.
Okay. Um, yeah. It doesn't seem to be working.
Okay.
It doesn't seem
Is there
Anyways, I was just going on. Don't worry. I just wanted to show some visuals of a traditional setting of clothing making, but it's not working.
You could always
okay? I
copy
changed.
the link and put it in the
Sorry.
chat.
Okay, let's try that.
Also, if you'd like to try one more time, I just changed sharing options.
Okay. Still not. Anyway, so the image that I wanted to share is, it doesn't seem to be working, but it was just a visual of an item of clothing that is made. So it was it's just something that I recently found out about just a couple of days ago. I really thought would be nice to share it here. So the whole idea is this very traditional idea of way of making clothes, which I recently found about. I mean, I've always known about it, but I didn't really know the backstory or the history behind it. So the whole idea is that the clothing is made in such a way that nothing is cut, but everything is stitched up, and whenever you feel like you're fed up with the idea of the clothing or the style of the clothing, you can just go ahead, take it apart, and then make it into something else. So, for example, if it was a skirt, it would be made without cutting anything at all. And then the whole idea is that if you're a mom and then you bought a piece of fabric where you thought you wanted to pass it on to your kids or anything, you would make a piece of clothing without cutting anything out of it, like you're cutting holes or making patterns, but you just make the full piece of cloth out of one full piece of fabric. And then at a point when your children grow up and you feel like you want to pass it on, you rip it apart and give it your kid to remake the whole thing again. So, I mean, learning about this, I find it even more interesting because here is not just about the relationships of the relationship with clothes that is being thought about, but also the afterlife and the extended life of that particular piece of clothing that is being thought of. and it could be used over and over and over again until it couldn't be used anymore. So imagine if like there was this thought of, sort of or this idea of making clothes that was inherent into, the fashion field or the fashion world. There wouldn't be so much, waste or so much going on that affects like fashion as we know it today. And this is all because there's always afterthought. There's this relationship, and there's this always afterthought on how the relationship, how the clothing, where the clothing is going to end up, how the second, if there's going to be a second user, how it's going to be, how the second user is going to use it, and how, if there's a third user, how it's going to go on. So there's always this long thoughts being put in place or being had in notion when clothes are made, or when even the concept of clothing is conceived. And for me, and generally, this is a point where, like, we've come where there is this shift, because the global north, the whole idea of, fashion as you see it today is being shifted, because it's moving so fast that we don't even pay attention to the relationship that we should have with the clothing, but only see it as a piece of item. And before I would just end my trip, I just timed myself for 30 minutes. So before I end with my presentation, one thing that I would like to say is that fashion is something that, I mean, all of us here, I'm pretty sure fashion is something that we are enthused about. So if that is one thing that makes us happy, or that's one happy place for us, why would we be in a space where we allow it to just dwindle in our eyes? Thank you.
Thank you, Ceremony. So Priya, can you start presenting Draven's?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Sammy, thank you for going first.
You're welcome.
I wanted Sammy to go first because Sammy's literally on the ground in Ghana experiencing those firsthand. So I really wanted to make sure that you guys were really picking up on everything that he was saying, because it does relate back to fashion education here in the States. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so as mentioned earlier, my name is Draven, and SFI is the Sustainable Fashion Initiative that I currently run at my university. I go to the University of Cincinnati. And so Liz Ricketts, who also works with Sammy, which is how we know each other, um, co-founded or founded SFI in 2018. And it's a pretty revolutionary organization. SFI is one of the very first fashion organizations, sustainable fashion organizations in the United States that's working towards creating circularity in our design program. Um, as I have here, SFI seeks tangible, localized solutions and theoretical proposals. And what I mean by working towards a circular fashion model is making sure that everything that us as fashion students create has an afterlife cycle, or is able to be broken down and turned into a new product. So making sure that from the pattern making to full on production, that we're being very conscious of what we're creating and how it's going to be, how its second, third, fourth, infinite life is going to be afterwards. So the goals of SFI are to, one, reclaim the value lost by a linear fashion model through circular design methods and through the proper sorting and distribution of textile waste. Enrich the DAP fashion program through community-wide curriculum and communication. Share critical data points, progress reports, curated industry news, and student-generated content with the public. Build an ecosystem of local, national, and global circular economy partners. serve others by applying learnings to internal and external constituencies, and expand efforts to address the ethics of fashion as a whole. So the woman but with the kind of purpley background, that's Liz. And then the second picture is Zero Waste Daniel, who is a fashion designer out of New York, who works with a lot of the other students in SFI. And then the last picture is actually of a sorority on campus. One of the initiatives that I'm really proud that we started working on was encouraging for sororities and fraternities to actually reuse their old shirts they would use for like pledge weekend and all that kind of stuff. I'm not really well versed in like sorority fraternity events, but essentially just swapping out, since they order a ton of t-shirts, and reusing them in a cool way. So we do split panel t-shirts where we take 2 old t-shirts, split them down the middle and sew them up so it's a completely new shirt. And we can go to the next slide. So one of the biggest takeaways that we like people to understand with SFI is that fashion design needs to evolve from creativity to a system of waste management, and essentially saying that these things are the same thing. For too long in education, the fashion industry has been really separated from the apparel industry, which is like, garment workers, factory workers, typically overseas, who are the actual production that gets these garments into fast fashion stores as well as non-fast fashion stores. And so we really want to expand the idea of what a fashion designer does. A fashion designer can be an anthropologist, they can be in waste management, and they also can be in environmental studies. With SFI, kind of the biggest thing that we've done as an organization, as you can kind of see here with like the blue bin that's like overfilled with muslin scraps, is that's how much we were throwing away on like every 2-day basis. I mean, our program is generating a ton of fabric scraps and a ton of waste. So that was the first thing as an organization that we decided to tackle, is like, how can we encourage people to be less wasteful? How can we reuse this waste? And we've actually done it really successfully. So we started out in 2018 by, at the end of the semester, going through all of these bins and collecting all the fabric waste. And we started with 1,075.7 pounds of waste in 2018. And the last time we were able to do a waste audit, which was spring of 2020, before COVID hit, we had gotten our waste down to 417 pounds of waste at the end of the semester. So a little under half is how much we were able to cut in terms of how much waste we are producing. And we did this by a couple different methodologies. The first thing we did is we made a resource closet. So we took an empty, just kind of supply closet and turned it into like a mini fabric boutique that students at University of Cincinnati could come in and just take whatever fabric they needed for a project, a personal project, if they just needed to make like a pair of curtains. And so essentially by recirculating the waste, we were able to cut down on how much new waste was being added. We also did a lot of little projects. We used fabric and turned it into paper that we could then use for a different use. We stuffed old mannequins with fabric scraps. We were able to send away scraps to be turned into shoddy, which is like just ground up fabric that then could be used to stuff pillows and punching bags and all of these other things. So that's fabric just didn't go straight to the trash. The challenges of collecting waste this way was we realized just how much people thought of fabric as garbage. In these blue bins, we would find food, we would find tampons, we would find pins, we would find just people essentially using the bins as a dumpster. And so that was the big challenge, was changing the behavior of people thinking of fabric as just trash. We can go to the next slide. So kind of the big question that we face with our university is like, how do we change tradition and kind of the dissonance between like creativity and managing your waste. I think through just our first year at SFI, where we were able to like cut that amount of, I guess 2 years, cut that amount of waste by under half. SFI proved that you can change systems of wastefulness into systems of sustainability. And we can go to the next slide. That's, oh, really quick. Sorry, go back one. I probably should describe the picture. So this is a bunch of SFI members where we do at our weekly meetings, where we collected all of the bins for the week, dumped it out on the floor, and then sorted it by what type of fabric it was and what color it was, by notions, which are like zippers and thread. So yeah, I just want to describe that picture real quick. We can go to the next slide. So kind of my main role in SFI is actually through a research lens. I really enjoy doing research. And we were actually able to publish our very first kind of academic report this past year, which was really exciting. So a lot of times people ask me, like, how does unpaid internships relate to sustainability at all? But it actually has a very easy through line. So the problem with unpaid internships is that it relates to low paid or free labor, excuse me, which we see is super common with overseas factories, and that these things are incredibly related. So this report is 62 pages, and it started with us surveying over 290 different people and getting their feedback on the different fashion internships they've taken. Fashion internships are really interesting because it's one of the few internships that we really see portrayed in media, right? Devil Wears Prada, Ugly Betty, trying to think of a third, The Hills, like all of these, Gossip Girl, like all of these shows kind of depict fashion internships as like really, really awful, really exploitative, long hours, no pay, being verbally or physically assaulted. And all of these things are very true that we found in our research, as well as like our personal experiences, me and the other two co-authors, personal experiences with fashion internships. And so we really wanted to research this and tie it back to financial sustainability. The way that we kind of categorize financial sustainability is just literally being able to sustain yourself financially, which unpaid internships don't. And then this kind of goes back to just fashion as an industry is really notorious for underpaying or not paying for labor. And then that's how we get to fast fashion, right? Where people are getting paid pennies to create garments that are going to like disintegrate after a year. So we can go to the next slide. So this is just a screenshot of one page of the report where we are kind of talking about recommendations for fashion education. The kind of big research takeaways we got from this is that probably the biggest one to me is that doing an unpaid internship does not mean you're going to get a paid job later because of that unpaid internship. Because that's kind of what you're told, right? You're told that if you just take this free internship, you will get paid an exposure or get paid an experience that could lead to a paid job. And we found that that's like simply not the case. We also found that sexual assaults, as well as emotional abuse and physical abuse were common in not almost everyone's, but a majority of people's experiences at their fashion internship, and that they had a really negative view of fashion after completing these fashion internships, which if you're getting into fashion, you almost always have to do multiple internships before you're able to find paid work, which is an issue if these are really toxic environments. So we wanted to focus on unpaid internships as well, because a lot of these kind of new sustainability brands are eco-friendly brands that have essentially made their money and become popular off of being sustainable, quote unquote. We're also some of the biggest perpetrators of creating these super toxic and harmful work environments. As far as recommendations for fashion education, since obviously going to school on the time you have off in fashion, you're trying to get an internship or you are interning, is we really wanted to see how school and how their role could be kind of helping facilitate change in this area. So we asked that fashion schools change how they market fashion as a major. I think the way that schools market fashion now is really irresponsible in terms of telling people that they're going to be the next, great fashion designer and not telling them any of the huge costs, that it takes to participate in fashion. Our school that we kind of use as a case study for this report, we have to complete 5 fashion internships before we're able to graduate. And that costs a lot of money, right? These jobs are mainly unpaid or super low paid, or we're given like a stipend, which is like a monthly allowance. But you still have to save up a lot of money to be able to pay for these. So no one talks about the financial cost when they're marketing fashion as a major. We also wanted schools to encourage new business models for students. When you're in fashion school, you should think about, if you want to become a designer at the end of this, how can you market your business? And also, how can you be less wasteful in the creation of becoming a fashion designer? We also think that schools should encourage the study of craft instead of focusing on internships as much. I think you come out a much better designer if you have a specialty in beadwork or leatherwork or embroidery versus working not 1,000, but like a bunch of internships for free, where you're really just making mood boards and tech packs and kind of just busy work getting coffee, when you can actually instead be learning like a really useful skill. We also encourage fashion schools to actually be researching their alumni, seeing how after they graduate with this fancy fashion degree, how many of them are actually, one, staying in fashion, and two, being paid in fashion as a career. So we can go to the next slide. I forgot to include something on the last slide, but I also wanted to talk about how kind of the way that we view decolonizing fashion school is moving away from capitalism, moving away from excess, and moving away from low paid labor and wastefulness. And that kind of concludes. I have a shorter presentation, so this concludes that. I have a link to SFI's website, and then as well as my personal website if anyone wants to reach out or has any further questions. And if you want to read the report too, it's on SFI's website. So that's it.
Thank you. That was like really informative and incredibly interesting. And I was very excited for today, and I'm glad that I learned so much today. I would like to start like the Q&A discussion. Oh, that reminds me. Supriya, can you put up like the slide thing?
Yeah, I got you.
And so I would like to start off this kind of section of the meeting by asking a few questions that I've like jotted down. Sammy, for starters, like as you like not at like a Western part of the globe, have you noticed like extreme environmental impacts because of like the textile waste due to like this deeply rooted sense of like exploitation and waste?
Hey, my video's finally working. Hi. I was trying to fix it the whole time. So, I mean, where do I even start from? The issue of waste is everywhere. Is not one. So I don't know if you've all heard of Cantamanto. So Cantamanto is probably the biggest secondhand clothing market in the whole of the world. Like it's very big, and Cantamanto sees about 150 million like clothing items almost like every week. So the amount of waste that comes in is enormous, and then only a little percentage, a little fraction of these clothing coming in is being like resold. So everything else ends in, you know, dump sites. And in the case of Ghana, there isn't really any sanitary landfills, because the one that we had has already been used. Like it expired 25 like years, before its actual time. And this is because there was more clothing waste coming in from the secondhand market, because there's so much being shipped in. So the impact is just one that goes on and on. And most of these places where like the clothes are dumped are like open sewers and gutters, so it ends up causing floods when it rains. Um, Most of these gutters also wash up into the sea, so we have like clothing waste just covered all along the beaches of Accra and Ghana, and then in the oceans. There is also the impact of, as I said it earlier, because there isn't any sanitary landfills, the clothing are just being dumped anywhere. And in most of these areas where the clothing waste are being dumped are you know low income areas, and like very very poverty engraved areas. So what happens is that when this happens, it's very easy for the government or people in authority to use that as a tool to disenfranchise these people. Because what happens is they tend to blame the people who live around these landfills for whatever it is that is happening. But the true issue that is not the case at all. It's somebody else's problem that is being highlighted here. So it's not like Kanzamanto or Ghana having these issues because we are creating the waste, or like because the issue is happening here, or this is where the problem is. It's only because the issue is being highlighted here in Accra or here in Ghana. So where that's actually where the problem comes from. So when it comes to the clothing, first-hand issue with clothing waste, it just goes on and on. Health issues, environmental issues, social issues, political issues. It just has its way of affecting everybody in diverse areas.
And so, in order to kind of like combat this shipment of all these waste going to like across the globe, is there anything that like we can do to combat this kind of
Okay.
thing?
Okay, so the first thing that I would want to say is that we become more conscious of the clothing that we are buying. I mean, we have all of these clothes coming in every day. Like we're constantly purchasing, we're constantly buying new stuff. But then the question that we need to ask ourselves anytime that we're purchasing these clothes, or the recommendation that I would make, is that anytime that you have the idea of buying a new pair of clothes, or you want to buy a new pair of a garment of any kind, you just need to ask yourself, do you really need that garment? Like ask yourself like all these questions. Do you really need it? Like why are you buying it? Where did it come from? Where is it going to end up? How long am I going to wear it for? And then when you move from these questions, as you're also going to clean up your wardrobe, or feel you want to dispose something off or send something in, ask yourself that particular clothing that you're going to put in the donation box, are you yourself, is it something that if someone was going to give it to you as a gift, would you like happily take it? Because the thing is, even though it's said to be something that is sent out for donation, it's a whole economy. Like people are actually cashing in on this. But the thing is, even if it was going out for free, the question is, would you, that particular piece of item that you want to give out, is it something that you would give to your, a loved one? Is it something that you would give to a friend? That is something that you need to ask yourself, because there are so many cases where clothing come in and they come in bills, and in these bills usually have like 100 200 300 pieces of clothing, and usually there's just about 50 of these pieces of clothing that is good enough to be reused. So what happens to all of these things? And then that is because people who are donating these clothes do not pay mindfulness, or are not conscious of the kind of clothing they're putting in. Imagine if you're putting a pair of jeans into a donation box and it has like a hole in it. Who do you actually expect to wear that item of clothing? If you're not going to wear it and you feel like it's a piece of trash, why do you feel like need to put in a donation box for someone else to wear? So I feel these are certain questions that we need to ask ourselves, because the moment that we The moment we just see clothing as clothing or just a piece of item, it just becomes a problem. We need to start, you know, having a relationship with a piece of clothing. So if you're gonna like pass it out or you're gonna give to somewhere, if you're gonna wear it, you need to ask yourself all of these questions, because at the end of the day, we're trying to build a relationship with the clothing. And it's only then that when we have a relationship with clothing that we start solving these issues that we have with fashion waste and all of these issues that we're having right now. Yeah.
Yeah. And though this like sense of like not thinking, not putting much thought into buying clothing and kind of giving life back into various clothing in our wardrobe, where do you think this, well, question for like both panelists, where do you think this kind of idea of like how we're treating clothes comes from? You know, is it, does it come from kind of like that West lens education from like the fashion, from your fashion professors and like all those, as you were Sammy, we were saying like the journalists was come in and such, was it like the fashion schooling and I guess like how we buy clothes as like children, is this kind of like establishing that sense of like fast fashion and disregarding like the like many clothes going into landfills? Like where do you think this idea is like rooted from?
Um, Draven, do you want to go?
Yeah, I can go.
Okay.
I think this idea has been rooted as far as just how fast trends happen now. Once we started buying for trends instead of buying because we actually love a certain garment or item, that's when all of this just got out of control. I mean, Sammy, you might know the statistic better than I do, but it's like how many pieces of clothing do Americans buy per year? Isn't it like 64? Something like, I feel like that sounds right. I don't know, don't quote me. But I mean, we buy a stupid amount of clothes now because trends have moved so quickly. You know, back in like the also before clothing was like really industrialized, which happened in the 80s to 90s, where clothing was just being able to be turned out really quickly versus you had to actually wait and have someone make something for you. Like Sammy was talking about earlier, I mean, we've completely disregarded that. We have no relationship with clothing in the global north anymore. Um, and so at least for me as like a fashion designer, I mean, even going into fashion school, I was still buying fast fashion. I didn't have really like, even though I wanted to make clothes, I didn't have a deep relationship with clothing until I was actually understanding how clothing is made. Like once you actually sit down, and Liz says this all the time, like she thinks that everyone who buys fast fashion should actually sit down and try sewing a button up, just a very simple button up, because the actual art and craft of making a garment completely changes your perspective. And we've gotten so far away from making any of our own things, any growing our own things, you know, eating our own things, that we, you know, where the dissonance is like so large that people just aren't mindful about it anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'll just add a little bit to what Raven said. As I was saying the whole time, it always starts with the relationship that we have with clothing. The moment that you see clothing just like, you know, as a piece of item that is disposable, it at that particular moment you are very very away or very very disassociated with everything that comes around clothing, because the thing is there's so many components of like a particular garment that we don't see, just like how you see like, you know, I don't know, a Mercedes Benz and then think of how, you know, it's well crafted and how you appreciate it. It's the same way that you should see basically any item of clothing, because this is something that people have actually sat down to work on, and I think that is where it stems from. And then the thing is also one thing that has to do with capitalism, because the moment that, you know, the whole idea of clothing is just about making the profits and like really, because clothing making is artisanal, it's craft, it's like, you know, it's creativity. So the moment that you see it as just like, you know, something that you profit from, then it just really takes away everything. And this, as I was saying earlier in my presentation, what tends to happen is that, you know, if a particular generation start feeling that way or start moving towards that direction where they don't really relate to clothes as they should, it is easily passed on. For example, as I said earlier, if I'm a parent and then I am buying, you know, like a lot of clothes, I'm buying new clothes almost every day, it's very easy for my kids to pick that, you know, that idea up even without me, you know, telling them what to do or what not to do. It's very easy for them to pick up. And what happens is that it goes on and on and on, becomes a tradition. It goes on and on and on, it becomes a culture. And before you know, it's very difficult to even move because like an entire space and entire people have shifted towards that dynamic, and it becomes very difficult to move from there. So I think the most important thing is, as I said earlier, or what really leads to this is the fact that like the whole idea of relations is just like moved away. It's just moved away. Like we just see it as like, you know, a piece of something that you can just buy and then throw away.
Yeah, yeah.
So I have a question. How do you guys practice this consciousness, and what do you do to? Sorry, what do you do to like be sustainable in your consumption?
Okay, yeah. So as I was saying earlier, it really starts with like paying attention and being conscious of the kind of clothes. I think for me, that is like the very first point. The moment that you start to see clothing in a different light as you previously saw it as something, not just something that you consume, that is truly when you start to make the shift. Because I mean, if you're going to buy something, I don't think you'd anybody in this world will treat anything right where they don't appreciate or have a relationship with. So it really starts from having a relationship or trying to appreciate the kind of clothing or trying to understand the kind of clothing that you're buying. It's only then that you like any of this will change. I mean, even if you're going to recycle whatever it is, it really, really starts from, you know, understanding and having the relationship. Because if you don't understand, you won't respect it. And if you don't respect it, then there's no change ever happening. It's just going to be, the same thing, like a ripple effect, the same thing happening over and over again. But the moment you start being conscious, Genevieve asked this question, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So Genevieve, if you're going to ask yourself every time that you buy, you know, a blouse or a skirt or a jacket or a pair of jeans, just like ask yourself these questions: where do I really need these clothes? Where are these clothes coming from? Am I paying the right price for this particular garment? I mean, imagine if you're buying like, you know, a button down shirt for $5 or $4. I mean, it doesn't even make sense to you. How much does it cost to make those, like the fabric in the first place? How much does it cost to make the notions that make the garment? How much does it cost to pay the garment worker? How much does it cost to transport the garments to here? How much does it cost for like all of the things? If you really, really think it through, and as Draven said, if you really actually sit down to appreciate or even try to just sew a button on, you tend to really appreciate and understand like what is going on in the piece of item that you're buying. Otherwise, you're just going to continually buy it continually. And then the fact that we have capitalism, there will always be someone out there who is just in it for the money. You just don't have to fall for it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
To like hop on to what Sammy said too, one of like the best pieces of advice I ever learned was from the stylist. And she told me what she does when she's contemplating buying something. And she'll put it in her like virtual, whatever. If she's shopping online, she'll put it in her shopping cart and then wait a week. And if at the end of the week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks she still wants it, then she will buy it. Like think like essentially put the item away for a little bit. And then if you're still thinking about it, then maybe it's something you should purchase. Also, you can think of cost per wear if something's really expensive. Break down how many times do I have to wear it in order to like justify buying this item. Like buying items of higher quality is always great. As well as before you buy something, think about how easy is it going to be for me to fix if like a tear happens or if a stain happens or if a button pops off. How easy is it going to be for me to fix? For me, or Sammy and I, since we both make clothes, I always to personally ask myself, can I make this? Because if I can make something that I'm looking at online, then that means I'm going to make it instead of buy it. And if I'm looking at it and I'm like, nah, I don't want to make it, then I really don't want it that badly.
Yeah, I
And
also. Oh, you can continue, Sammy.
oh yeah, I was just gonna add a little bit to what Raven said. So another thing is if you're going to purchase these items, Raven mentioned something when she was making her presentation about how they contribute into decreasing the amount of waste that is being added to the waste that they already have. Is if you're going to buy a new pair of jacket from a shop or whatever, like you should also ask yourself that, as you said, if you really need it. And then if not something, I mean, me and Draven, we are both like, designers and we can make our own clothes, but maybe that may not be the case for everybody. But the thing is, if you're also going to buy it, like what are the options that you could buy it from? Because one thing that one good agent of fashion waste management is like circularity. So if you're going to buy a piece of garment, like a brand new piece of garment, have you checked, like a thrift shop or a flea market or a second market or whatever, to see if you could find that garment? There's always swapping and things like that that actually help to decrease the amount of waste that we are making in terms of fashion. So yeah, so that's also something that you could consider.
Yeah, thank you. Also, what Draven said about what she heard from one of her stylists, I believe, was holding like a piece of clothing in the cart and like waiting it for a while. Because I know, like myself, I get like sucked into trends because I just see like what's on media and I'm like, oh, that's really nice. And so that, and I feel like having putting that clothing aside for a little bit and see if you actually still like it is would like for me personally would be a good kind of tip that I can use to kind of get out of that trend cycle and like buying clothes and just keeping it for a while. Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions for the panelists?
Yeah, I have a question. My question would be that you had said earlier um, you had like on your college campus for people who had clothes that they would like to, I guess, not throw away. Do you have like videos or like a platform, because it's like the pandemic right now, so I know that some people don't want to get near certain places. Um, but is there like a video that you could like show us that we could do at home to do with clothes, extra clothes that we have, instead of like giving it away or throwing it away? Because I get rid of clothes often too. So the fact that you can like repurpose it for like punching bags or pillows, like that's super interesting, and I would want to do that. So is there like a platform that you have those videos, or like what we can do so that we don't have to throw it away? We can just like repurpose it.
Was that for me or Sammy?
For anybody who'd like, well, most likely you, because you had talked about that. You did it more at your campus.
Yeah, so we were mainly doing that with like fabric waste from the fashion program, but we have actually done I think 3 now. We call them like our black market swaps. So we get people to donate their old clothing to us as an organization, and then on Instagram we hold like a live swap. So it's like for every item you donate, you get like a little virtual ticket, and then you can like shop with that ticket on like an Instagram that we made that's called like SFI Swap. And that's been a really good way for people to like get new items of clothing without having to pay for them. And then also you can get rid of your stuff and maybe swap it out with something that you find more interesting. So that's been really successful with us so far. We've been able to like recirculate clothing um, through that way a lot.
And what you said earlier about like repurposing the clothes, would you be interested? Like, I'm trying to ask if there's videos or like how-tos on how to repurpose the clothes. I guess.
Oh, like
So I'm trying to-
tutorials?
Yeah, instead of like sending it to where you guys would handle it, instead, like how could we personally handle it at home by ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it we've actually been like sending it to other places who then like shred the clothing for us, let's turn it into shoddy, and then they're able to like give it to like mattress companies or like the like filling like the boxing, like the punching bags. um so we don't personally do it in-house, but we send it out to people who are able to do it. um I mean, something that I've done is like I've made like an actual like mannequin and I've stuffed the entire thing with fabric waste. If you're into making clothes, is also like a great way to use it. As far as like making the paper, we were able to do that ourselves with just a blender and like essentially like a wood screen that has like a metal mesh material through it to like get the water through. And there's like tons of YouTube tutorials on how to make paper out of fabric. You just have to make sure that it is like 100% cotton or 100% hemp, something that's a plant-based fiber, not a plastic fiber like polyester. Also, just screen printing on old clothes or hemming it or taking off the sleeves and turning it into something different is also a good tip.
Um, I would I would just add a little bit to what Draven said, to answer Crystal's question. So one thing about this too is, I mean, have fun with it. You don't necessarily need to. I mean, personally, before I really got into this and even I started designing, I always I was always interested in recycling and repurposing anything. Most of the times, I really didn't know what it was that I was making. But I mean, it's also nice if you also use the opportunity to test your own creativity. I mean, create whatever, and then there are tons of like tutorials on YouTube that you could find online that you can always work on your old clothes, like I'll use those as guidance for when we're working your old clothes. Yeah. So man, there's so many things that you could do at home, and then you could even use it as a challenge for yourself, like in your home, wherever you live, your college mates or your family, wherever you could. It's always an activity that you could do among your friends. And then for me, one thing that I always say is like most importantly is it's a good thing to always have the conversation, keep the conversation going on, because I feel there are people who are genuinely not aware of all of these things. But the moment like you start going on, you might have like a mother or an auntie or a friend interested, and the conversation goes on. So you really don't have to have it all figured out. Just the fact that you have the intention of like reworking or reusing or revamping or repurposing some of your own clothes is good enough. You just have to make the step of like, creating whatever it is that you find out there.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because now everybody I've seen is like making, they have like their clothing brands, and they're making. Because I thought of having a clothing brand as well, but I've considered that, most of the things that they buy, like most of the things I buy, I kind of just throw away or give it away, or give it to the thrift store. But I forgot your, I didn't catch your name, but
Samuel.
you were saying, oh, okay, thank you. I think you were saying how you, with t-shirts that you like cut it up and then you sewed it back together. So that's like a good idea to do with like old clothes, to repurpose that. Like I didn't even think about that to do. So thank you for the advice.
Yeah, you're welcome.